Good morning, everyone. We will get started. On behalf of the Armenian Studies program, I'd like to welcome you to this presentation. For those of you on the East Coast, good afternoon. Those of you maybe in Armenia, good evening. And those of you on the West Coast, good morning. I'm Professor Barlo Dermagerdician of the Armenian Studies program. And this presentation is part of the Armenian Studies program Spring 2021 lecture series. And today I'd like to start off with a brief presentation of some of the upcoming events in the Armenian Studies program Spring lecture series. So I'm going to share the screen and we're going to take a look at some brief events that are coming up in April after today's presentation. So I'll share that with you. These are our upcoming events in the month of April. It's not complete yet because we still are planning for some events toward the end of April. As many of you know, I'm hosting a radio hour called All Things Armenian, which is held every Sunday from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock on Multicultural 1600 AM. That's live streamed. You can hear it anywhere in the world. And I usually interview guests on a variety of topics. Our next event after that is actually going to be a presentation by myself on Armenian art, and in particular on Armenian architecture. I'll be talking about Armenian church architecture. This is part of the Arts in Motion Week, which is the College of Arts and Humanities Gala Week, and this event is part of that. That's going to take place on Friday, April the 9th at 7 p.m. All of our events will be through Zoom, and the registration links are seen below. Then also I'm participating in the 9th annual Genocide Awareness Week, which is hosted by Scottsdale Community College in Arizona. Of course, usually this is an in-person event, but this year it's going to be again through a Zoom link. And I'll be holding a conversation on the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. It will take place at Thursday, April the 15th at 10 o'clock in the morning. You can also see some of the other activities of the Genocide Awareness Week, because the Genocide Awareness Week encompasses activities from Monday through Thursday, from April 12th through April 17th. And then on April the 16th, Friday, April the 16th, we're going to be having a discussion on a movie called The Last Inhabitant. The Last Inhabitant is about the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict seen through the eyes of a small village in Karabakh. The director is Jivan Avedisian. We'll be watching the film, an opportunity to watch the film from April 9th to April 16th. And then on Friday, April the 16th at 5:30 p.m., we're going to have a discussion with the director himself. And this is co-sponsored by Cineculture, which is the Friday movie class here at Fresno State and the Center for Creativity and the Arts. For any of you that would like to follow our events, you can do so on Facebook at Armenian Studies Fresno State. And you can also follow our events on our website at fresnostate.edu/Armenian Studies. These are just some of our upcoming events that will be taking place. So today I'd like to introduce our guest, who will be Dr. Khatchig Mouradian. Dr. Mouradian is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. He holds a doctorate in history from the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. In fall 2016, Dr. Mouradian was the Henry S. Khanzadian Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies at Fresno State, where he taught a course and gave 3 public lectures. He is also the author of articles on genocide, mass violence, unarmed resistance, and is the co-editor of a forthcoming book on the late Ottoman history. In 2021, Dr. Mouradian was appointed as the Armenian and Georgian area specialist in the African and Middle Eastern Division, that's the Near East section of the Library of Congress. Today, he's going to be speaking about his new book, which is based on his dissertation. He'll talk to you about it. The book is called The Resistance Network, the Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915 to 1918. Following his presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to Dr. Mouradian, and you'll be using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. For those of you that are joining us, you just click on the chat area and then go ahead and write out your questions. You can do so during the presentation, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll be reading through the questions and asking Dr. Mouradian questions. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Khatchig Mouradian. Dr. Mouradian.
Thank you, Professor Barlan Burduchan, for the invitation. This is, I'm very happy to be here, albeit virtually. The Fresno State Armenian Studies program is a program that is near and dear to my heart. As you mentioned, I was the Kazan visiting professor there. And in fact, as I acknowledge in the book, that is where the process of turning this dissertation into a book started. So those few months that I spent in Fresno were the opportunity, alongside teaching and giving a few public lectures, was an opportunity for me to work on my book project. And here it is now. The Resistance Network was published a couple months ago from the Michigan State University Press. So thank you again for encouraging and supporting scholars, and for also inviting me again to speak to your audience. Today I'm going to spend some time showing some images and presenting part of the arguments and the issues that I tackle in the book. I will try to make that portion around 30-35 minutes, after which I'm happy to answer questions and discuss further, focusing on topics that might be of greater interest to the viewership here. Allow me to start by just saying a few words. I will be sharing some images in this presentation, but perhaps allow me to start with a picture that essentially ends up gracing the cover of the book. This is an image that of Nora Altinyan, who is the woman seated near the center of the picture, and Reverend Aharon Shirajian, who is the man standing right next to her. You notice his imposing presence in the photograph, surrounded by administrators and staff of what is referred to as Shirajian Orphanage, after Shirajian himself, who was the director. The photograph is from the HBU Nubar Library Archives in Paris, France. And the selection of this particular photograph to be on the cover of the book is, of course, deliberate. Oftentimes, when we think about the Armenian Genocide, we think about destruction, death, deportations, and ultimately, this is a narrative of massacres, what has happened to the Armenians, what the Ottoman Turkish authorities have done. And in that kind of narrative, the role played by Armenian deportees in pushing back against these genocidal policies, in resisting these actions, is often understated or altogether ignored. And what I try to do in the Resistance Network is demonstrate how there was a robust underground network of Armenians, locals, Muslims, Jews, and others, as well as missionaries and diplomats who secretly engaged in an expansive effort to assist in helping and saving Armenian deportees. This effort was quite well organized and emanating out of Aleppo, radiating out of Aleppo as the center. And in many ways, this is an effort to address the narrative that I am generally critiquing of talking about the Armenian genocide as, on the one hand, the victimization of Armenians. So Armenians are passive recipients of violence. And on the other, the portrayal of Armenians as passive recipients of humanitarian aid humanitarianism, Western humanitarianism, and trying to reinforce and argue that Armenian agency, the role of Armenians in the efforts to push back against the genocidal policies on the one hand, and in the efforts to engage in humanitarian work in the region as the genocide was unfolding, was critical. Armenians played a critical role in resisting the Ottoman policies of genocide and the Western efforts to provide relief and aid. These resistance efforts were largely unarmed, largely civilian efforts, and that is what the book focuses on. Now, doing this, the photograph really tries to articulate some of the central ideas that I have in the book. The first being that at the core of this are civilians, Armenians, who are part of this network, part of this effort. One of the things that happens oftentimes when we do not talk about unarmed forms of resistance to genocide is that the role of the women is diminished. When we really expand, widen the aperture, and try to look at all kinds of efforts of resistance against the authorities, you see here the role of the women also becoming very clear. And this photograph, again, captures that as well, captures the fact that this was a group effort, and it focuses on one of the locations in Aleppo where this resistance effort was very much in full swing, beginning in May 1915 and eventually in subsequent months all the way until the end of World War I. So with this introduction, let me start with a brief overview of the book and the central arguments. This is another image, the image of the Aleppo Armenian community leaders, including in the center, you see Father Yesayan, who headed a council of refugees that was established in Aleppo during the Armenian Genocide early on in May 1915. This council for refugees engaged in an expansive humanitarian effort, initially with the tacit support of the local authorities, and later on had to go underground and secretly continue the work. Another person that I will be referring to in this presentation are the Mazlumian brothers, Arminak Mazlumian, the owners and operators of the famed Hotel Baron in Aleppo, who also had a critical role in this effort that I discuss in the book. Now, allow me to start with the darkest point of the Armenian Genocide. In the summer of 1916, a town on the fringes of a crumbling empire became a synonym for the deportation, dispossession, and destruction of the Armenians. Away from the eyes of the world, the sands of their Zor crystallized the affliction of a nation, and generations of Armenians adopted the town as a synonym for the indescribable. For over a century, scholars seem to have largely avoided retracing the path to Deir Zor. Until recently, one would have been hard-pressed to find scholarly work attempting to make sense of the complex history of the extirpation of the Armenians in Syria and Mesopotamia. To this day, the destruction of the Armenian deportees who had arrived in Ottoman Syria, central as it is to the history of the genocide and omnipresent as it is in the memoirs of survivors, remains understudied, with the exception of a few works, including the works of scholars such as Raymond Kevorkian and Taner Akçam, both of whom served as my dissertation on my dissertation committee. Dr. Akçam was also my dissertation committee advisor. All we had, apart from some of these few works, all we had were snippets, overviews, and summaries of what happened in Syria in 1915 and 1916. We all hear about the genocide. We all talk about Armenians being deported to the desert. Deir Zor is a central part of the Armenian memory of the Armenian genocide. Yet at the same time, the scholarship does not reflect that by any stretch. This void in Armenian genocide historiography was due to a combination of methodological challenges, political realities, and the inaccessibility of critical primary sources. In the face of the Turkish state's aggressive genocide denial campaigns, the scholarship and public discourse on the Armenian genocide have focused on the victimization and destruction of Armenians, often ignoring the historical record on Armenian mobilization and resistance. It is as if by granting perpetrators absolute power, the case for asserting the veracity of the genocide were strengthened. And even when we talk about armed resistance, the focus is often on armed resistance, particularly resistance in places such as Van, Urfa, Shabin Karahisar, Musadagh. So, but if we think about it for a moment, resistance is an entire spectrum of actions, and armed resistance is just a sliver on that spectrum. I define resistance in my work as actions carried out to save Armenians during the genocide, actions carried out against the will of the authorities or against the law, and therefore they constitute resistance, right? Armenians and others, missionaries, locals, were not engaging in these actions with the blessing of the Ottoman Turkish authorities. And therefore, what they were doing by risking their lives, risking imprisonment, and risking torture. And you will see many of the individuals that we'll be talking about will be killed or imprisoned or die of disease contracted from the deportees. So this was dangerous work. And it was resistance because it was going against the will of the authorities. And that is what I'm going to be highlighting. So even though not a single bullet will be fired in this entire presentation in terms of what I will be describing, much of these efforts constitutes acts of resistance and defiance against the authorities. The scholarship on the wartime and interwar Western humanitarian efforts during the Armenian genocide has its own blind spots. It largely misses the connections Western humanitarians forged with local Christians and Muslims and arriving deportees, and the central role these Ottoman subjects themselves played in humanitarian work. Armenians and others not only launched an extensive effort months before relief funds started flowing in from the United States and Europe by the predecessors of Near East Relief, which is known by many, but also Armenians took upon themselves the task of distributing aid to the deportees beyond the reach of consuls and missionaries, with Armenian couriers carrying funds or supplies to areas and encampments as far away from Aleppo as Idlib, Ma'ara, and Deir ez-Zor. So in the resistance network, I challenge explicit and implicit depictions of Armenians as passive recipients of violence on the one hand and of Western humanitarianism on the other. The scholarship and the public discourse largely define the perpetrators and Western humanitarians, but not the targeted group, as actors, focusing on how the former killed and the latter saved. Yet our understanding of the dynamics of mass violence would be flawed without fully integrating the targeted group's responses into the narrative. Although the genocidal machine aims to maximize the power asymmetry that propels it, it cannot erase the opposition of the victims, both as individuals and as a group. Zooming in on one region of the Ottoman Empire during the Great War, which is the region of Ottoman Syria, particularly the triangle between Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and Deir ez-Zor, I demonstrate in this talk and in the book how Armenians coordinated a robust humanitarian resistance effort. And in the remaining part of the talk, I want to focus on this particular effort, how it evolved, and how it operated against the policies of the central authorities. Armenians did indeed resist as soon as the Committee of Union and Progress enacted the empire-wide arrests, deportations, and massacres in the spring of 1915. In the aftermath of the April 24 arrests, for instance, which are the arrest of Armenian leadership, intellectuals, that ultimately were one of the initial signs of this genocidal policy being unleashed. Shavash Misakyan, an Armenian leader and intellectual in Istanbul who had escaped arrest, organized a clandestine chain of communication between the Ottoman provinces, Istanbul, and the outside world, smuggling reports of atrocities out of the country. Others created groups that procured, transferred, and distributed funds, food and medication to exiles, saved them from sexual slavery, created safe houses and underground orphanages, and upheld deportee morale as hundreds of communities were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and marched in the direction of Syria. In the Resistance Network, I explore the role of an indigenous, organized, and sustained effort to help deportees, led by Aleppo's Armenian community. This effort was in full swing 4 months before the establishment of the Armenian Relief Committee in the United States in September 1915. And these Armenian groups were loosely interlinked, operating out of cities where population was only partly deported, Istanbul and Aleppo, and along railroad lines stretching from Istanbul to Konya, Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and Mosul. And I talk about these interlinked groups because it's not just one person, it's not even one committee or one group. There are several groups that are working with one another, coordinating with one another often, but at the same time, they're engaging in their own work. Just in the specific case of Aleppo, you have the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Armenian Catholic Church, and the Armenian Protestant Church, all having their own efforts and initiatives, and at the same time working with one another towards in areas where mutual efforts are helpful and could prove more productive. In the book, I situate these resistance efforts. And again, when I say resistance, I'm talking about this range of Armenian responses that are against the will of the authorities aimed at saving Armenian deportees. I situate these resistance efforts within a range of victim responses, including the exploitation of and profiteering from fellow Armenians, corruption and misappropriation of humanitarian assistance, collaboration with Turkish authorities, gendarmes, police, and even post office officials in order to denounce, extort, deport, and in rare cases, sexually abuse and kill deportees. As such, this is not a hagiography of resistance, nor an attempt to glorify victims. And to quote one scholar, historian John Cox, by exaggerating resistance, which can imply condemnation of those who did not resist, end of quote. So in the book, it's not like I don't portray all Armenian deportees who are arriving in this region in Syria as people who are resisting. There are a range of responses. Some people are actually collaborating. Some people are engaging in actions that are aimed at profiting from fellow Armenians. So there's this whole range of responses that I tackle, and the resistance is at the forefront of all that. And one of the things that is striking as we look at this region, and let me take a step back to give a general sense of the region I'm covering and the period that I'm covering. So the Armenian Genocide, the deportations of Armenians, and the arrest of intellectuals begin in April 1915. These deportees, by early May of 1915, you have hundreds of survivors of these initial deportations arriving in northern Syria. In subsequent months, as almost the entire population of the Ottoman Empire is deported and led on death marches, massacred. You have increasingly tens and then hundreds of thousands of survivors arriving in the region that I'm covering by the summer and early fall of 1915. So these are the people who have survived the initial rounds of massacres and deportations and made it to what was supposed to be their destination, Syria, and particularly the region that I'm covering. Now, what is striking is how fast some deportees who were arriving in Syria became part of this resistance network, despite the risks involved, and in many cases, despite their unfamiliarity with the region. As you can imagine, the local Armenian community in Aleppo that initially started this humanitarian effort was familiar with the environment and with the region. They also were familiar with the languages spoken in the region, particularly Arabic, as the deportees who are arriving do not necessarily know any Arabic, and many of them are completely unfamiliar with the region. However, they join forces, at least some of them, join forces with the local Aleppo Armenian community and become part of this humanitarian effort, and then ultimately go underground and secretly start working to save Armenians, particularly beginning in the fall of 1915 and beyond. One example is Reverend Aharon Shirajian, who, again, his image is on the cover of the book. He knew what it meant to challenge the authorities. He had been imprisoned and tortured in 1895, yet soon after his convoy arrived in Aleppo from Marash in the spring of 1915, he took the helm of an orphanage that sheltered thousands of children and did not give in despite harassment and repeated arrests. The resistance network that pushed back at Istanbul's policies was at its core comprised of a few dozen dedicated Armenian religious and secular community leaders, Western missionaries and diplomats, and deportees who had arrived in Syria beginning in the spring of 1915. They served as the glue connecting a much larger constituency of Armenians, local Muslims, Jewish and Christian volunteers who helped in any way they could. Great as the sacrifices of resistors were, what magnified their impact and sustained the effort for the duration of the war was the coordination between the network's nodes and their replaceability. When members were killed, arrested, exiled, burned out, or decided to withdraw for one reason or the other, others assumed their responsibilities and the work continued. This network maximized the use of the built environment as it worked to save deportees. Armenian churches, schools, and institutions became focal points of community mobilization and deportee support. Hospitals, hotels, and other businesses owned by local Armenians or other sympathetic to the plight of deportees doubled as hideouts, shelters, makeshift orphanages, gathering places, and venues for the network's meetings. By the summer of 1915, as conglomerating in churches and schools made it easy for the authorities to round up and deport Armenians to the desert, deportees used false papers to rent rooms and commandeered abandoned buildings and street corners. It is from such urban hideouts that members of the resistance network often planned operations that stretched to other cities, rural areas, and the desert. Just to give you a sense and appreciation of some of these locations that I am talking about, let me share some images here. So as I mentioned, one of the sources that I use are the Armenian Prelacy archives, records in Aleppo, and which provide invaluable information, particularly the minutes of meetings of this Council for Refugees that was established in May of 1915. And they at first start working openly, and then when the central authorities start persecuting and arresting and killing many of the leaders of this committee and other similar committees, this group goes underground. So these are the minutes of that group, the Council for Refugees, established by the Armenian Apostolic Church. This is one of the lists of deportees that was prepared by this committee and its volunteers. You see that for every single convoy that is arriving from between May and June of 1915, there is a detailed list, which village they're coming from, what are the names of the heads of each family, how many men, women in each group and in each family, as well as other additional details like date of arrival, etc. It just gives you a sense of the kind of work that was being done. And then, of course, the central authorities will crack down on this, will attack these efforts. And this is also documented in the book. These are some receipts from purchases that were made in order to assist deportees, anything from wood and eggs to bribes that were paid to gendarmes. We don't have the receipts for those bribes. But all of these are listed in ledgers. Every single expense that is made during the entire period of the war are listed in ledgers that are also part of the archives of the prelacy. Here in this picture, you see a number of religious figures who are involved in this effort. This is an image from the archives of the Armenian Catholicosate in Antilles. And the picture is taken in 1920 with Catholicos Saak Khabayan in the center. He was also played a critical role in Aleppo in these efforts. This is another image. This is an image of Hotel Baron, where the Mazlumian brothers wined and dined leading figures in Ottoman Syria and managed to mediate and often hide and save many Armenians during this period until they were exiled to Zahle later during the genocide. This is another individual who plays a critical role in the resistance network. My book starts with him, opens with him. It is Reverend Eskijian, and this image is from his family archive. This is a quote next to it by his wife, who says, "My dear Badveli, barely out of bed from his sickness, disregarding the personal hardships and peril of his own life, relentlessly labored day and night to save other lives. Together, we pressed ourselves to the very limit of our endurance. All our time, energy, effort, sleep, food, clothing, and other material possessions we put on the line in behalf of this wretched, miserable mass of torn and battered humanity." These are the words of Gülenia Eskijian, written in a letter from 1919. I have access to the letter thanks to the family. And Reverend Eskijian himself contracted typhus and died within a few months of the arrival of these deportees. Yet his legacy endures, and the work that he started is continued by others around him and beyond. This is another image from the Catholicosate archives in Antilles, taken in 1925. Many of these children are orphans from the Antilles orphanage. Many of these children were in orphanages during the Armenian Genocide, or some of them were actually on the streets, fending for themselves. Some of these children will also be part of the resistance network, and I document that as well, both in the city of Aleppo, as well as in concentration camps along the Euphrates, all the way to Deir ez-Zor. Now, I will wrap up in 2 minutes, and perhaps we can develop a discussion after that. Outside of urban areas, the villages and the tent towns near concentration camps that authorities used to establish telegraph stations and gendarmerie outposts also harbored safe houses for the network, thanks to local Muslims collaborating with Armenians. Some of these Armenians and their Muslim associates had established relationships that predated the war. Still, most couriers hid in the very network of camps that they were secretly traversing. One of the things that this resistance network engaged in was sending couriers from Aleppo to these camps along the Euphrates, to Deir Zor and elsewhere, in order to distribute funds, distribute medication and assistance. These efforts, these forays were extremely dangerous. Many of the people who engaged in these acts were arrested, imprisoned, and some were killed. I tell the stories of a number of such couriers in the book, including women. And as I do that, I try to demonstrate how much is lost in this narrative, how much is lost in the history because of the very dedication of these women and men. What we have today, in certain cases, some of these couriers, in one case, there's one courier whose work I document, and we only know his first name, just his first name. We don't know anything else about him, about his dreams, about his family, not even his last name. These are people who were constantly in an environment where Armenians were already being targeted and killed. They placed themselves over and over again in the line of fire, endangered their lives as they tried to take and bring assistance to these areas, the rural areas, as well as these concentration camps, oftentimes in the dark, oftentimes pretending to be Muslim merchants, etc. And as such, the book in many ways is also a story of these individuals. So this resistance network sent money, food, and medicines to the concentration camps whenever possible. The emissaries were a few Armenians who often made the stopover under the cloak of darkness, as I said, or disguised as Muslim merchants during the day. The network also helped many deportees escape internment, forced labor, and sexual slavery, and provided safe houses in Aleppo for escapees. As I mentioned again, women played a critical role in this effort. In the Meskene concentration camp, a few of the women who had witnessed the destitute condition of children set up an orphanage on 11 March 1916. This is a tent orphanage in the middle of the desert. 3 women from Nida took on the responsibility of caring for the orphans. As word spread, more and more orphans came to the tent. What started as a shelter for a few children soon provided refuge to hundreds. The women frantically tried to secure supplies for the orphans. They pleaded with camp officials, asked deportees for donations, and tried to solicit outside help. They were not always successful. One of the women, Raquel Kirazian, was beaten up on several occasions by a warehouse official for repeatedly requesting food for the starving children. I document also many other women who are part of these couriers who are sending information and assistance to Deir Zor and beyond. Over the past decades, hundreds of accounts, memoirs, monographs, and scholarly articles and books dedicated to Western humanitarians serving in the Ottoman Empire have been published in many languages. Numerous events organized by survivors, their children and grandchildren around the world, have honored these humanitarians, their children and their grandchildren. But the Armenian members of this resistance network, as well as Muslim and Jewish members of the group, who are all locals in the region, who, and I'm quoting here, at the risk of their lives and the cost of 1,000 sacrifices, have helped and relieved thousands of exiles starving in the deserts, in the words of one of the central characters in the book. These people have received little attention. My book connects them all. In doing so, it demonstrates how much is suppressed from the narrative when the actions and the words of the targeted group are relegated to the margin. Many of our families have in our drawers, in our coffers, in our bookshelves, manuscripts, diaries, and accounts of survivors' experiences during the Armenian Genocide, oftentimes written by family members. And in many ways, we don't think much of these documents often. And often these documents just languish wherever they are. Partly perhaps because we feel like everybody else, all other Armenians went through the same experience. And what can that one particular story or account add to the narrative? Had it not been to many families who shared their stories and their accounts with me, had it not been, including, I gave examples, the Eskijians here, as well as others, Jesse B. Jackson, Consul Jesse B. Jackson of Aleppo, his family. Without these sources, without these accounts, one of the most important parts of the history of the Armenian Genocide would have remained less known and would have been something that is forgotten. These Armenian accounts, these oftentimes memoirs, diaries, handwritten accounts, really helped me bring together, piece together, an experience of genocide that is not just about victimhood, that is not just about helplessness, but also about efforts to organize and push back. And as such, my book, The Resistance Network, stands on the stories of the survivors themselves. It examines and challenges the conventional thinking about mass violence, the targeted group's reaction to it, and intervention. It demonstrates the role of community structures and key connectors and the role they can play when a group is under attack, and the importance of working with them, not putting them to work in devising and implementing any form of humanitarian action. I would like to conclude by sharing a photograph with you and saying a few words about it. This is an image I took in Deir ez-Zor in 2009. The picture is in a village called Bushehr, and it is a mound that was recently discovered at that point of a mass grave from the Armenian Genocide. The locals were building a school. They started digging up. They found these bones, and they decided to build a school right next to that mass grave. But this mound, this mass grave, became the playground for many of the children in that school. So when we visited here, and I was accompanied by journalists, including a journalist from The Economist, who later on wrote about her experience, and others, we were scratching the surface of the sand, and as many of you have heard, you have these bones and pieces of skulls protruding. And these children, when they saw what we were doing, they came up to us and they started giving us pieces of bone. And we asked them, what are these? And they said, Armenians. Now, since 2009, this region has been swept into another war. Other massacres have taken place in the region. And I share this photograph right now because I think about it often. I think about it because I do not know where these children are. Many of these villages are evacuated now. Many of these families have become refugees themselves. I do not know where these children are, in which refugee camp, and where. Their stories are the stories of today. And how we think and how we react and how we engage with their stories and their experiences will very much define the stories that people will tell 100 years from now when they're talking about this particular catastrophe. So thank you all very much for joining me on this journey, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mouradian, for your presentation, your overview, your highlighting the important points in the book. So I invite our audience to please write in the chat area of Zoom if you have some questions. While you're doing that, I'll just go ahead and start it off because I have a couple of questions, but I'll ask one to start with. Because you mentioned several times the local network in Aleppo, the local Armenian network. And you mentioned that they were at times harassed and even arrested. But were these local Armenians ever subjected to the order for deportation as Armenians were in other parts of the Ottoman Empire? And if they weren't, why wasn't that done?
Thank you. That's a great question. In fact, the Armenian community in Aleppo was by and large not deported. I say by and large because there are, so this was a small community of around 10,000 Armenians in the edges of the empire, and they were not deported, but their deportation or their exemption from deportation was not something that was clear at any point during World War I. For instance, even as late as 1917, there is a telegram from the governor of Aleppo to Talat Pasha, the Minister of Interior, saying that the Armenian community here is worried about deportation. They fear that their turn is coming. What can be said about this? And Talat Pasha responds and says, tell them that there won't be a deportation. I say this just to emphasize the fact that, long after even the massacres in Deir Zor in 1916, where you have, more than 200,000 Armenians massacred in August, in the summer and early fall of 1916. Even long after that, there was the fear that the Armenian community in Aleppo was going to be deported. I also say partly, by and large, not deported because hundreds of Armenians from Aleppo were indeed deported. Those who did not have the paperwork, those who weren't registered as Aleppo residents, were deported, and they were in the hundreds, because many people had come from other places like Sassoon and Arapgir and elsewhere, and they hadn't actually switched their identification documents, and they therefore still held papers that identified them as being from Sassoon or Arapgir or other regions. Many of these people, particularly workers, are going to be deported in this process. Many others who were part of this network are arrested or killed. So the picture was much worse. And just saying that they were not deported by and large does not capture it. But the Ottoman authorities, to come to the second part of the question, did not get to the point of engaging in these kinds of deportations, these areas that are again outside, areas where there are large concentrations of Armenians, or actually it wasn't a major issue for them. There was another element that I go into in the book, I'm trying to summarize, which is that in the case of Aleppo, and also in the case of Raqqa and some other places in the Ottoman Empire, the local elites, sometimes the local political figures, local Arabs, will actually be against any kind of efforts to deport their Armenian local population. So I get into this at length in the book as well, but this is sort of an overview and a quick response to your question.
Okay, and again, I encourage those that have questions or would like to communicate. So here's a question. Was the Near East Relief in Aleppo or their predecessor organizations connected to the resistance efforts? And then a secondary question, was Ambassador Morgenthau involved in resistance in any way?
The short answer is yes to both. I focus on the Near East Relief and its predecessors is the way you frame it is accurate because its predecessors were doing the work during the early months of the genocide. Many of these figures are critical in terms of bringing the assistance into the region and handing oftentimes the funds over to Armenian couriers, who in turn will distribute these funds and purchase medication and other things with the use of these funds. To give you an example, John Minassian, who was a teenager during World War I when World War I erupts, he was the person who, again, a deportee who arrives in Aleppo and becomes the person that the Reverend Eskijian employs to engage in the dangerous task of going and visiting the American consul in Aleppo, Jesse B. Jackson, taking a suitcase from him, which clearly had the money that was being sent through these relief efforts in the West, and taking it to Reverend Eskijian, who in turn would distribute these funds to deportees. I do document others who are involved in these efforts who actually become an integral part of this resistance network. And many of them will, the Armenians were targeted specifically, and many of the Armenians will be killed or arrested or die. But people like Jesse B. Jackson, consul, was constantly harassed and being followed. We know that from Ottoman documents. There are other missionaries and teachers, Swiss and others, who will be, in certain cases, forced to shut down their operations. And in one case that I document in the book, she will have a nervous breakdown because of what she witnesses and what happens to her own employees, these couriers who are killed, Armenian couriers who are killed. She's going to have a nervous breakdown, and her colleagues are going to take her out of the country. Her name is Beatrice Rohner. So there are all these other activists and figures and humanitarians who are an integral part of this. What this book does emphasize is the fact that, contrary to what we generally present as millions of dollars, the equivalent of a few $1 billion in today's money being raised in the United States and helping starving Armenians, right? The story that I portray and demonstrate with all the evidence that I have is that the starving Armenians were not just sitting there and starving and waiting to be fed. Many of them were organizing, and not only were helping these missionaries and diplomats, they actually were carrying the largest and more dangerous part of the burden, putting their own lives in line in order to assist others across the region.
Okay, so again, please use the chat function to ask questions. And I have a follow-up question to you also, Dr. Mouradian, Khatchig, about the multiple networks. So you mentioned local Armenians, you mentioned missionaries, and then you mentioned Near East Relief. Did they work together, or did they have their own individual networks? So at some point, were they able to work together to coordinate, or not?
Yes, there was much coordination. So for instance, Jesse B. Jackson coordinated with the Armenian Church, coordinated with Reverend, I'm just giving a few examples here. Both Reverend Shirajian, whom I mentioned before, was running the orphanage, and Reverend Eskijian. They also coordinated with other central figures in the region, Armenian members of Armenian elites, the Altunian family, which ran a hospital, one of the most advanced hospitals in the empire, the Mazlumian brothers who ran the Hotel Baron, and the missionaries themselves were also working with these, some missionaries, some teachers, and others were also working with the consuls and these other groups. So again, I gave the example of Beatrice Rohner. She was in constant touch with other missionaries, the German consul, and others. So there was much coordination. Unfortunately, though, when you look at the reports and the records, and later on at the historiography, more often than not, what happens is that the role of the Armenians in this effort is diminished. And it becomes a story about how the West is raising, people in the United States and elsewhere are raising money. And somehow that money is appearing in the hands of survivors. And in the middle, right, there is this struggle of life and death, the struggle against genocidal policies that is often ignored or just presented as a footnote.
Okay, and then there's a question. It says, are there other examples of organized resistance efforts in the Ottoman Empire similar to Aleppo? And I presume it means not necessarily the armed resistance, but just some sort of networks. So again, other examples.
That's a great question. There are several such efforts that I found in my own research. I provide a brief overview of some of them in my book. There was a network that was operating essentially between Istanbul and Aleppo that involved the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul as well as many others along the railroad. There were Armenians who were employed by the railroad. There were Armenians who were part of, communication networks in this region. And I talk about this a little bit whenever I talk about some of these actors and their role in Aleppo and Syria. But there are also efforts in Istanbul, most certainly, in the interior, even in places where a large majority of the Armenian population was deported or killed. You still had people on the ground who were going around collecting information and sending the information to Istanbul, and then from there to Europe, to the United States. That's how many newspapers got their news and reports about what's going on in the interior of the Ottoman Empire. And these networks were very impressive. There is a book in Armenian about one group based in the correspondence of one group based in Istanbul of three Armenian revolutionaries and intellectuals whose sole task is to clandestinely, secretly collect these information from what's going on during the genocide, and secretly send them through contacts and couriers on people in other embassies in the capital to the outside world. So the short answer is yes, there were several such networks. And the reason I selected Aleppo and Syria in general was because Syria is seen as essentially the ground zero of the Armenian genocide. Deir is seen as the Auschwitz of the Armenian genocide. These are the darkest places of destruction and annihilation. And my thought was that if I demonstrate that even in the worst corners of the genocide, there are ways to resist, to survive, and help fellow Armenians, you can extrapolate that and think about what is going on in places across the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, I have another question from an audience member whose grandparents came from Çomaklı and ended up in Aleppo. So the question is, was there a Red Cross set up there, presumably in Aleppo? Was the Red Cross in Aleppo?
Yes. So in Aleppo, there were several, by the way, efforts, including Red Cross, including the Muslim equivalent, the Hilal al-Ahmar, the Red Crescent, and as far as the assisting Armenians were concerned, much of the assistance in this period, it's the history. Let me take a step back. I'm saying things without providing context. The history of the role of the Red Cross, and particularly its Ottoman equivalent, and their role during the Armenian genocide, has not been properly completely documented. In fact, I believe that the Ottoman Red Crescent archives are not even explored to see what there is there about the experience of Armenians, although largely they were not assisting Armenians, but we can glean much from their work. As far as other organizations in Aleppo are concerned, there were several that were German institutions or enjoyed the support of the German consulate. And this was a way, sort of a cover that these institutions received as allies of the Ottoman Empire during World War I, and therefore were able to function. American institutions and groups and individuals, again, the United States, until it entered the war later during World War was able to maintain this kind of neutral role, and through that role play a critical, on the ground, a crucial role, particularly through the efforts of Jesse B. Jackson. So these are some of the general institutions that are working here. And this also includes, as I mentioned, the Red Cross at certain points, although, again, I have not studied the history of the Red Cross in the region. However, I do know that there are efforts to stop them from working, particularly in 1916 and after. That is documented in the work of scholars like Taner Akçam and others.
Okay, another question. At what point in time were letters written in English prohibited from being mailed within Turkey, necessitating reliance on couriers? Was this also true in Syria?
This is a complicated question. Let me focus on the Syria portion. The couriers that I'm referring to here first are people who are carrying items, funds, medication to deportees who are not supposed to be getting them. So a regular postal service is not going to deliver money and assistance to deportees who are slated for, who are prisoners in concentration camps or going to be killed in places like their zone. So the couriers, what they're doing is a parallel clandestine underground network of people who are taking these letters, bringing these funds, assistance to deportees. However, there was still a functioning postal service in the Ottoman Empire, including in Syria. And as I show in the book, there are several places where deportees, if they paid bribes, they could even get money in certain cases, essentially wired to them, sent to them from Istanbul to Aleppo. They could get the money by going to the postal service. Same thing applies to letters. For instance, one of the ways in which Consul Jackson talks about the massacres in Deir ez-Zor and how after the massacres in Deir ez-Zor there was complete silence. Almost all the Armenians in the region were annihilated. One of the ways he demonstrates this is by saying that by the fall of 1916, we started getting fewer and fewer letters from Deir ez-Zor, and then the letters stopped altogether. So for him, in many ways, those letters were a sign of this. So it's important to note that there's two things at work here. One is an actual postal service that is operating within the Ottoman Empire, including the ability not just to send letters, but also to send funds. And I talk about this particularly in the case of one Armenian who is actually involved in extortion and takes advantage of fellow deportees because he has access to the postal service. And so I get into some detail in the book on that particular example and case.
Well, I think I don't see any other questions. I want to thank Dr. Mouradian for his presentation. I highly recommend the book. It's called The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915-1918, to give us a different perspective on an understudied area of Armenian history. Thank you, Dr. Mouradian, for your presentation.
Thank you, Professor Dermagoudian. Thank you all for being part of this conversation.
Thank you all, and we'll see you at our upcoming events. And if you'd like to, again, watch this again or tell other people about it, you can have them watch on our YouTube channel at the Armenian Studies YouTube channel. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you